Folks, thanks for coming along tonight, where Deborah Conway makes a welcome first appearance at the Sydney Institute. She's well known, so I'll introduce her very briefly as a singer, songwriter and a guitarist, and author of the Deborah Conway Book of Life, which we've got copies of tonight, and I'm sure our speaker will be happy to sign them. And tonight's topic is Life After Book of Life. Deborah Conway, you're very welcome.
There are so many ways I could begin this speech. It's difficult to know where to start. It was a rainy night, August night, when the 1959 World Tour of the Bolshoi Ballet performed at Melbourne's Palais Theatre, but despite having bought their tickets months in advance, only my father was in attendance. My mother was busy producing my first appearance at the Jessie McPherson Maternity Hospital. Rainy night, perhaps a bit old school. I could begin with my family, or when I first became a musician, or becoming an author. Maybe it doesn't matter after all. It's only the beginning. Boom tish. I grew up in Melbourne, in the bosom of my Jewish family. My Jewish education was patchy. Jewish kindergarten, but not Jewish day school. Jewish Sunday school, Jewish summer camp, and Jewish dancing class in the local Anglican church. Shabbat dinner every Friday night with my grandma. 2 nights of Seder, the family meal that celebrates Passover, where my dad would try and get through the service as quickly as he could, eat, and then lay on the couch snoozing. Fasting on Yom Kippur and the regular shul hop on all the high holy days. We'd start in Kew, head to Temple Beth, a quick stop at Turak Shul to see my nana, who hosted a Jewish version of Christmas lunch on December 25. Then over to Charnwood Grove to hear the shofar being blown by Rabbi Lebowski. We never had pork products in the house, though there weren't too many questions asked about what was in the fried rice when we got takeaway Chinese from our local on a Sunday night. While my parents were observant, they were not particularly religious. God wasn't a feature of my Jewish education. I believed in Jews, and I didn't need to believe in God to do that. At 18, I bought myself a guitar and started teaching myself to play farmers' chords, as we call them, C, G, F. There's barely a Bob Dylan song you can't play with C, G, F. I joined my first band at 20. It was thrilling to play rock and roll loudly to a room full of music lovers, hanging off my every note, all of us working on our future tinnitus together. We played hard for 8 months, and then I ran away to Sydney with the drummer, in a purely professional sense, to form a new band. We released our debut album, Domestic Harmony, in 1985. The debut single from that album became a surprise top 5 Australian hit that kicked a gender equality conversation up the pop charts. The band was Do Re Mi and the song is Man Overboard. I still perform it because it still means something. Most of Do Re Mi's songs were inspired by the heightened political times. In the early 1980s, the Cold War dominated foreign policy. The nuclear clock was perilously close to midnight. The arms race was in a final sprint. Not that we knew that then, and the mutually assured destruction strategy of brinkmanship that proffered if one superpower were to use their nuclear capability, then they would be signing their own death warrant was, as its acronym advertised, completely mad. We were a product of our environment. My leftist socialist tendencies were part of how I thought of myself growing up. My brushes with socialism had been brief, but had made an impression, good and bad. As a teenager, I had first encountered voluntary socialism visiting a kibbutz in Israel. The setup looked rosy, though I remember thinking it seemed a bit rough not to be able to sleep in the same house as your parents. In my mid-20s, I encountered the Musicians' Union. We'd heard about this organisation that ensured that the second violin player was getting their requisite tea break and the bassoon player would be clocking off at exactly the end of her call and not one note more. But it was laughable in our sector, a kind of anti-rock and roll collective that had nothing to say for us or to us. However, if you were booked to play Countdown, the Musicians' Union were then men in bow ties hanging around the ABC studios in Ripponlea to ensure that only fully paid-up members would be allowed to ply their wares on the biggest national live music television program on air. If you wanted your new single seen and heard by a large proportion of the demographically interested music-buying audience, you paid those union dues. The Musicians' Union wasn't arguing that the ABC should pay for our appearances, or warning young bands to be wary of signing deals to record companies that used terms in their contracts like in perpetuity, the territory being the known and unknown universe, and mentioned formats existing and yet to be invented. They just collect their dues and you'd never hear from them again. It didn't strike us as a fair system. In 1986, Do Re Mi were on tour through Britain, the Netherlands, Austria and Germany. And I wrote about it in my book, and I'm going to read that excerpt to you. West Berlin was like nowhere I had ever been. It was the living, breathing manifestation of capitalism, propped up by the Allied powers, the US, the French and the British, all pumping rivers of gold into this shining example of the other side of the ideological coin. Capitalism on steroids, a punch in the nose for the other team. I spent hours wandering around this extraordinary city with its countless fountains in beautiful public squares whose boulevards were lined with department stores full of luxury items. The effect was dazzling, as if the very streets were diamond-studded. And then, abruptly, we were all operating inside an absurdly clumsy metaphor. There was the wall, cutting a brutalist concrete slash topped with barbed wire across the once grand city of Berlin that had fallen so utterly, so abominably to the unspeakable atrocities wrought by Hitler and his many, many willing accomplices. Here was the unintended consequence of the National Socialists' enduring legacy, the rise and rise of the other kind of socialism. The following day, the four of us applied for a visa, which cost us Deutschmark 5 Deutschmark, and entered East Berlin via the heavily guarded checkpoint Charlie. We had to exchange 25 Deutschmarks into East German currency at the exchange rate of 1 to 1. Outrageous, because the East German currency was worth a fraction of that. We were warned that we were forbidden to leave East Berlin with any East German marks in our possession. We walked through checkpoint Charlie and travelled back in time to 1946. The walls were covered in pockmarks from World War II bullets. We wandered around decrepit streetscapes of ruined, collapsing buildings, waiting for an earth mover to put them out of their misery. Everyone walking past us grimly wrapped in a grey overcoat. No bill posters, no advertising of any sort. Apart from the red insignia on the many uniformed guards we saw on the streets, we had entered a world drained of colour. We had a map and tried to work out where we might eat lunch or look at a shop, and eventually found a cafeteria, expansive but empty. The food we ordered from the uninterested waitress was as colourless as everything we had seen. There were no pictures on the walls, but the windows onto the street were large, and we could see the grey clouds darkening the skies, draining the light to complete the perfect greyness. The 25 Deutschmarks we had exchanged put a lot of East German marks in our pockets. But aside from lunch, we could find nowhere to spend them. There were no museums or galleries. We looked for a shop, but aside from a single display window that appeared to be selling recorders, but with no visible entrance, we eventually gave up. And so, with our allotted few hours spent, the four intrepid band members, who all identified so strongly with the left and its promises of the good and the kind, headed back to checkpoint Charlie to cross freely with our Australian passports back into the West. But we had a problem. Our wallets were stuffed with East German marks, which we had been cautioned we had to spend before we attempted to leave, and failure to do so would result in unpleasant consequences, the details of which we had no desire to flesh out. I tried to give mine to a man passing by, but he looked at me in horror and walked rapidly away. I thought about giving them to the border guard, but sensed this would have been deeply frowned on as a bribe implying guilt of some kind. I opted to discreetly deposit the notes into a bin, the first and last time I have literally thrown my money away. There was distrust from everyone we encountered. I felt no romance, no sense of justice, no intrigue, just a blunt feeling of threat. I would like to say that 1986 was the beginning of the end of my unquestioning, if less than full-throated, allegiance to the ideology I'd signed on to. As a band, we thought of ourselves as a collective, as anti-capitalist. But our visit to East Berlin didn't instigate a conversation about whether what we decided we were against was so very bad and what we imagined we were for was so very good. We were deeply invested in our worldview, in which the far right produced egregious evil, and fair enough, it did. But why did we stop there? Why didn't we interrogate the far left's responsibility for unimaginable horrors? It took me way too long to work out that the apparent polar opposites are close cousins. At the beginning of the 1990s, this is back to me now, having written a speech last week. At the beginning of the 1990s, I put out my first solo album, String of Pearls, with a single that was played on every radio station, sometimes simultaneously, despite the film clip shot on an autumnal golf course where I performed in red plaid +4s. It's only the beginning, and in a way it was. Shortly afterwards, I met Willi Zieger, a guitarist, a Jewish guitarist, who I employed for the next 9 months of touring. The spark we both felt when I opened my front door to Willi that day has fueled 33 years of our collaboration on every possible thing there is to collaborate on, including 3 daughters, 10 albums, and 2 Jewish music festivals. I called my second solo album Bitch Epic and totally owned it. I performed through all my pregnancies, for one tour wearing red sequins with a gold mesh cutout bordered with rhinestones over my belly. I played Patsy Cline in the early 2000s, loving every minute of that glorious singer's incredible legacy. In 2003, we became an independent music entity, called our new label Intercore, silent S. Our first release in 2004 was accompanied by a brand new, never-before-tried marketing approach. Using the genius of the internet, we promoted the Summerwear Party. Buy 25 copies of our CD and we would turn up to your place to deliver and sign them and play a 4-song acoustic set. We had broken the old marketing mould. It gave us new ideas of relating to audiences. In the mid-noughties, Willi and I produced a series of concerts called Broad, a direct response to my frustration that female singer-songwriters were lumped together as a monolithic genre, ignoring the extraordinary variety of women's contributions across multitudes of styles. In 2008, Willi and I released an album called Half Man, Half Woman. The last song we wrote for this was Take Pity on the Beast, played over jagged guitars and drum loops, forming the solid, hypnotic bed of irresistible force that would half carry, half push the listener across an 8-minute pilgrimage. Willi had the title and the first chorus. It was enough. I ran hard and fast and came up with a full cast of characters, friends, our fathers. It is not often you can point to something and say, before this we were this, and after this we were something else. For my climactic penultimate verse, I sought inspiration from the Haggadah. The Haggadah is the little prayer book we read at Passover, which is kind of the retelling of the story of Exodus through various commentaries from different rabbis. When Israel went forth from Egypt, Jacob's household from a people of alien tongue, Judah became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea saw and fled, the Jordan turned backward, the mountains skipped like rams, and the hills like young lambs. What ails you, O sea, that you flee? O Jordan, that you turn backward? O mountains, that you skip like rams? O hills, like young lambs? Is this the description of an earthquake? A mystical vision? The ecstatic response of the Jewish diaspora returning? A natural phenomenon only able to be understood through transcendent rhapsodizing? Questions don't always need answers to make sense of something. This was sense-making in the metaphysical realm. The lines came to me unbidden. After so many seders, I knew them backwards, which is how they came out. And there we were, in a place I hadn't glimpsed before. I had written a song with the fullest sense of my being as a Jew. I had finally placed side by side what I did with who I was. It was like a light went on. Before this, we were this, and after this, we were something else. In 2010, Jewish copyright lawyer and music fan Gary Holzman decided to mount the Sheer Madness Sydney Jewish Music Festival. He asked us to perform at it, and we got invited back in 2012. By the time we played Sheer Madness again in 2013, we had released Stories of Ghosts, an album of songs based on a loose dialogue around Torah themes and how they apply in a 21st century context. How these millennium-old stories can still speak to us through the poetry of the words, and beyond that, what it means to be Jewish, a meditation on the complexity of what holds us to the earth in an age of atheism and rising anti-Semitism. The rich vein of material we started mining in 2008 proved to be an enduring well of inspiration for both of us. The conception, connections and creation, full of discussion, dissent, disagreement, that included inspiring us to mount the Sheer Madness Music Festival in Melbourne, a roller coaster of a learning curve, but a roaring success for lovers of Jewish music. I have been a performer, musician, songwriter, producer, and most recently author for more than 40 years now, which makes me a veteran. I've been lucky enough to work at many different aspects of making music and music events. And I'm here to tell you, the creative process doesn't get any easier. The true essence of what I do, which is songwriting and recording, the process of finding things to say that haven't been said in quite the same way before, is a lifelong challenge. But then I guess if the exquisite torture of the creative process, the tyranny of the blank page, were not so formidable, perhaps I would have lost interest. Human beings need challenges to foster a healthy forward momentum. Jews have certainly been fortunate in that regard. Our challenges are constant, multiple and enduring. We are constantly being challenged, chosen to be challenged. Through 5 millennium, we have been challenged. Attacks, sackings, conquests, expulsions, slavery, persecution, pogroms, the Spanish Inquisition, forced conversion, the Holocaust, the combined Arab armies, Hamas and Hezbollah. In every generation, they rise against us to annihilate us. There is a strong argument to be made that this animus is the centrifugal force that prevents us fragmenting and dissipating into the larger community. We are the people of the book, not just a religion. We are a tribe, a nation, and for so long a diaspora. Suffering untold loss, we have continued to gather together to find common ground with our communities. The Jews survive, and the miracle of the state of Israel is the living embodiment of our contract to continue to do so. There's a push and pull to this. Our survival is not just our stubborn refusal to succumb to the multiple attempts to eradicate us, but also because of our unique relationship to God, to our practice, to the value we place on the well-mounted challenge to a current orthodoxy, to learning, and to our innate ability to adapt. It has exercised in us a limber mind. When I was growing up and attending my Church of England school in Melbourne, my parents would occasionally ask me if I was experiencing any anti-Semitism. I always said no. I thought they were paranoid. I thought it belonged to another time. I was dismissive of their concerns. Anti-Semitism was something from history, not something I had ever encountered or felt in any way threatened by. The reason I'm here is because on October 3rd, my autobiography, Book of Life, was released by Alan and Unwin. 4 days later, the world changed. The invasion of more than 4,000 Hamas-supporting terrorists into southern Israel, murdering, raping, burning, pillaging, kidnapping unarmed citizens, children, women, men, the elderly, even babies, was, as we have all read many, many times now, the worst atrocity and highest death count of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. We are about to mark a year anniversary, and there are still 100 hostages being held. The collective trauma has only intensified. Last month I read the suicide note of a young man who had been at the Nova Music Festival, marvelling at a beautiful sunrise moments before Hamas perpetrated its murderous onslaught. He hid in a bush. His friend was dragged from where she was also hiding in bushes, and he watched her being brutally raped by 4 men before they put a bullet in her. He couldn't help her, and he couldn't live with himself because he couldn't help her, so he didn't. His farewell note was devastating, an account of unbearable guilt, the guilt of being helpless, the guilt of surviving. A few weeks ago, 6 hostages, 4 of them in their 20s, were murdered in the Rafah tunnels. The response from the world has been a collective yawn, with one infamous Australian influencer posting on her Instagram page, "I don't believe for a second Hamas executed those hostages. Israel's desperation stinks." On the 9th of October, as we all know, the celebrations of resistance on the steps of the Sydney Opera House were seen all around the world. Large groups of angry, mainly men, screaming, "Fuck the Jews." The only law enforcement was turned against a couple of Jews who had turned up on the advice that the New South Wales government would be projecting the Israeli flag on the Opera House sails in memoriam of the lives lost 2 days before. The protests were not an outlier. Ever since October 7, the cankerous wound of anti-Semitism, sometimes trying to disguise itself as anti-Zionism, has broken out of the compression bandages that was barely containing it and erupted on university campuses, in encampments, in city streets, in hate-filled graffiti, on and on. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. Truly, it has been sickening. There is barely a peep from our federal government. There are few to no consequences for all the vandalising of offices, the intimidation of citizens, the hate preached from pulpits, the incitements, a kidnap, the doxing of 600 Jewish academics and creatives, aka the Zio 600. The protests that call themselves peaceful but don't feel peaceful in any way. It has all been covered extensively. A few weeks later, Israel began its incursion into Gaza. There were a lot of casualties. There was also a lot of misinformation about the ratio of fighters to civilians in the casualty numbers. According to the Hamas Ministry of Health, no combatants were killed, only women and children. If true, this was clearly completely tragic. But it wasn't. The statistics were being cynically massaged and manipulated. Pallywood was in overdrive. The old cliche, truth is the first casualty of war, while the blood libel lies kept metastasising, the Jew hate around the world intensifying, and the pro-Palestinian activists glorifying Hamas as the noble resistance fighting the jackbooted fascists of the IDF. No one bothered to zoom out for the wider picture. No one bothered to understand any history of the region, the conflict, the multitudes of attempts at peace deals, the ancient connection of Jews to Israel, to Jerusalem. It was all too tempting to simply overlay the coloniser, oppressor, racist canard over the Middle East, point the finger at Israel and say, "You're the problem." What a popular game this turned out to be. The UN, the EU, our institutions of education, the sandstone universities leading the way, journalism, the unions, the medical establishment, the law, the arts, feminists, the literary world, etc., all climbed aboard the anti-Semitic/anti-Zionist train of haters. And there were so many of them on board, all supporting one another, that the conformity, the rightness, the belonging felt so good. Heavens! We haven't been allowed to hate anyone for the longest time. And now, look, what a gift. We can hate the Jews. Sorry, only the Jews who support Israel. Like a pressure cooker with a steam valve released, the cries of "fuck the Jews" from everywhere, under the stinking breath of those in polite society, have become indiscernible from the thugs burning flags. Since October 7, the world has been plunged into an updated Alice through the looking glass. Genocide, the term first coined by Raphael Lemkin at the Nuremberg trials to describe the Nazis' crimes against the Jews, is now the accusation thrown as a weapon at Israel to describe their defensive war in Gaza. Ethnic cleansing, what the surrounding Arab countries did to their Jewish populations after the establishment of Israel, is now the term used to describe the actions of the IDF to remove Hamas from power. Concentration camp, the stopover between life and death for the Jews of mid-20th century Europe, built in multiples by the Nazis, is now what they call Gaza. And despite the blatant lie inherent in the description, in all the descriptions, the world is eager to buy the lies wholesale, and then tut-tut at the monstrousness of the Jews, who know firsthand what genocide, ethnic cleansing and concentration camps are, and yet still inflict them on their neighbours. So much easier to hate the Jews once you have decided they are just Nazis 2.0. On October 4th, we opened our show at Arts Centre Melbourne, Songs from the Book of Life. excuse my deviation for a moment, but I need to tell you the show, 8 songs around 8 scenes, is a 3-dimensional version of my book. A theatrical, musical distillation of my life with sets, props, interactive footage and choreography. It's pretty good if I do say so myself. Scene 4 is a discussion of Jewishness, my Jewishness, a discussion that by its very nature had to include a brief analysis of anti-Semitism. It was something Willie and I had been witnessing for several decades. Hate moving inexorably with the gathering pace of a stampeding herd. We have written, are still writing, songs addressing these issues. But this excerpt from our show was very direct and, as you might imagine, challenging to perform. After the matinee of performance of October 7, it became an existential howl. The history of the Jew lurches through chapter and verse of persecution for multitudes of contradictory reasons. We are the wandering Jew, the rootless cosmopolitan. We are the outsider. We are the controllers of finance and industry, of Hollywood and the media. We are the insider. We are insular, infiltrators, untrustworthy, ready to break our vows. We're arrogant, God's chosen, pushy, weak, loud, stealthy, communist, capitalist, once too oriental, now too white. Anti-Semitism motivates its adherents to attribute to the Jew whatever their society deems its most detestable qualities. And throughout history, Jews pay with blood. Maybe all a Jew can do is pace the stage and pray. And there I was, a Jew, pacing the stage for the matinee on October 7, when our youngest daughter, who had recently made Aliyah and was living in Tel Aviv, was texting from her apartment's stairwell to let us know she was sheltering and safe. It was the first we heard of the attacks. My darling youngest daughter is a party animal, and if she had not recently split with her Israeli boyfriend, they might both have been at the Nova Festival. On November 26th, Mushroom held a 50th anniversary celebration at which we were asked to perform. The audience was a full house at Rod Laver Arena, 12,000 strong, and around 2 million watching on free-to-air TV. Willie and I wore white suits, blue shirts. He wore a white yarmulke. I wore my oversized Magen David. I introduced It's Only the Beginning, saying, Michael Gudinski hated what I wore in the video clip for this song. You'll recall it was +4s. But I think he would have loved this outfit. I had marked us as targets. A few pics were snapped backstage and went up online, me posing with a couple of Yothu Yindi members and Kate Sobrano. There was an outpouring of support from some in our social media pages, but the post also attracted a lot of ugly, faintly threatening commentary, referencing blood on the white suits of genocide supporters. The genocide supporter was baffling. Hang on, I don't support genocide, never have as a matter of fact. Regardless, the calls for hanging our heads in shame, we are disgusting, everything we have ever touched is now tainted, and the very personal slur of being a talentless has-been made frequent appearances. A few weeks later, the Sydney Theatre Company opening night of The Seagull caused uproar when 3 of the cast members donned kaffirs for their curtain call. The fallout was intense. Board members resigned, subscribers cancelled, donations were withdrawn. In the wake of all this, I was invited to talk to Patricia Cavellis on Radio National. The interview was supposed to be about the equivalence, if there was any, between the Sydney Theatre Company donning kaffirs and Willie and I dressing as we did for the Mushroom event. It could have been an interesting discussion, but my interviewer was not to be mollified merely with a sartorial, and so within a few minutes the conversation turned to Gaza, with Miss Cavellis insisting Israel was solely and only fully responsible for the high death toll of innocent civilians. The next few moments became ground zero for my total fall from grace. The haters have relished decoupling a very few words, 7 to be exact, from the context of their intent and wave them as a flag to proclaim my craven disregard for human suffering. The meaning of my words in context are when Hamas puts weapons in the hands of underage boys to point at the enemy, they use them as fighters and then use them in the childhood casualty count. To say this is a horrendous, cynical exploitation of young lives is a chronic understatement. But the mountain of evidence remains unexamined by the pro-Palestine groups defending Hamas as freedom fighters. So there I was, a new book, my first book, and a full dance card of author talks, in conversations and writers' festivals. And then things started to fall apart. It seems that many people who patronised writers' festivals, people who are so fond of debate, who are such warriors for the exchange of free ideas, who support the social justice campaigns for the great and the good, are perfectly happy to kowtow to the loudest, most disruptive voices and minimise the ideas that a few disruptors find offensive. Writing WA and Newcastle Writers' Festival stood by me. Sadly, they were forced to employ a phalanx of security to protect me and the audience from whatever threats were being made. There were others that walked back their invitations. I don't know if I blame them or not, but the dishonesty is the ultimate gaslighting, coming up with elaborate excuses rather than fess up to the fear, intimidation, or maybe that they agree that I really am a genocidal, bloodthirsty maniac who enjoys the suffering of small children. A children's charity I had been approached to perform a fundraiser for cancelled my appearance, citing they'd received pushback after the save the date notices had been sent out. Stand up to them, I said. Don't cave to this appalling bullying. They caved. At a bookshop in Brisbane, I did a hastily organised in-conversation to promote my book, and a gathering of furious, unhinged protesters turned up on a quiet suburban street to harass us all and the people who were attending, wailing accusations of genocide, hiding behind their masks and signs of globalise the Intifada and Zionist equals Nazis. A dozen police had to attend, but did nothing to shut down the protest. And there's the silence, the events that simply don't materialise, though you were sure they would. Our theatre shows have been routinely targeted, causing some promoters to cave and cancel our appearances, others to double down in their determination to stand by us while being forced to hire security for our protection. Most recently, we performed in Hobart. There were people outside protesting and handing out pamphlets of my villainy. Inside, activists disrupted our show numbers of times, yelling, having to be forcibly removed from the theatre, and at the last disruption, a patron decided to take matters into her own hands, break her wine glass on the edge of the stage before threatening a protester who had just started yelling at me that I should be ashamed. It was mayhem, a small glimpse into societal breakdown. Last month, the glass wielder was sentenced to 49 hours of community service. The protesters are emboldened in their fight for justice. How they think turning two Melbourne musicians' theatre show staged in Hobart into a screaming melee could possibly change the course of the war in the Middle East is a fascinating proposition. I'll wait. These are interesting times. A few weeks ago, the Byron Bay Writers' Festival cancelled me. This was the second time. They weren't happy with just once. Let me explain. On the 31st of October, I was invited to be part of the Byron Writers' Festival, renowned for its relaxed atmosphere and diverse program of stimulating and entertaining conversations. We aim to bring writers together in an environment that nurtures and invigorates them as much as it does our audiences. Great! I accepted their invitation immediately. On March the 8th, I received another message from the very relaxed Byron Bay Writers' Festival to say they're very excited to instead offer me an out-of-season event. They would book a theatre and fly us up. I smelt a rat. I am clearly not as relaxed and laid back as the Byron Bay Writers' Festival. I responded through my publisher that I would far prefer to be in the scrum of the festival proper, but I wasn't given a choice. So I accepted their changed invitation, and then, as I had suspected all along, the very relaxed Byron Bay Writers' Festival, that prides itself on offering a diverse program of stimulating and entertaining conversation, decided I was a little bit too diverse for their sensitive souls. "Oh no," they screamed as they climbed onto the chairs and skirts and noses held high. "She thinks Israel should be allowed to exist." They cited the aforementioned incident at the Playhouse Theatre in Hobart as the reason, but without context. I was left to wonder, had they received threats? Were they nervous to endanger their audiences? Or are they fully on board with cancelling someone who believes Israel should be allowed to exist? I hear Michael Gawenda was passed over for John Lyons to moderate an Israel-Palestine discussion. Perhaps that is the answer. I keep being told I'm brave. We're brave. But I'm not sure we had a choice. I never felt I could do anything other than stand my ground against the unreason. It is self-defence against insanity. I have not spoken to some close friends for many months. I don't know why entirely. I'm sure they know that we're not bloodthirsty, genocide-justifying lunatics. We've known each other for a long time. You'd think something like that would have come out already. Nevertheless, they are definitely not talking to us, but it doesn't hurt, because ultimately I can't lie about something so fundamental to my being. To say, hey, maybe you're right, Israel is an apartheid, colonising, racist, genocidal state that should just disappear. Nah, better to find new friends, and I have. I've also done some soul searching. My name is Deborah. The name comes from the Book of Judges. Deborah the judge, who sang her troops into battle. I'm not sure how much of a warrior I can be at age 65. I'm still a pretty good singer. But I always knew that if I was going to pick a hill to die on, defending the right of Israel to exist would be it. And the corollary, calling out blatant, unexamined anti-Semitism from all the good, the kind, the righteous, the educated, the clever, the concerned, even amongst people I could never, ever have imagined would fall for it. Then here I am. Hineni, Hineni, I'm ready. Anti-Semitism is a war that has to be fought, even if it can never be won. Thank you.
So, many thanks to Deborah Conway. A pretty good performance, I would have thought, from a talented has-been. I thought you did pretty well. So if you just come back up here and we'll come to questions and discussion. I should say that copies of Deborah Conway's Book of Life are available tonight and will also be advertised by Anne online for those who are watching online, and those are on the Zoom as well. So you just come back up here and I'll get
Okay.
Just take this. Thanks for that. I listened to your interview with Patricia Cavellis, and I agree that it was completely misinterpreted, not even by her but by others, because what you're essentially saying is what you said tonight, that men of 16 and 17 are not children if they've got rifles in their hand. But compare that treatment you got with the treatment that recently of people like Anthony Lowenstein, who got the whole of Australia story, and most recently Louise Adler in The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. How do you feel about that lot?
I think I'm confused, really. I find Louise Adler a very confusing human being. I'm not quite sure what she's trying to prove. But people like Louise Adler and Anthony Lowenstein are incredibly useful to the people who are pushing this leftist line of Israel being genocidal, colonialist, racist, apartheid entity, because they are Jews who side with that point of view, and so they can be wheeled out and held up as an example to say, look, these Jews believe that this is correct, so how can it be otherwise? But they're not representative of the Jewish community in Australia. Far, far from it. Most Jews most Jews around the world, you would count themselves as people who believe that Israel had the right to exist, i.e. Zionists. And yes, of course, there are people who don't believe that, and some of them are Jews. And they become the spokespeople because they justify this terrible other position that everybody wants to tear it up. And I'm sorry that they are given such huge platforms to say this stuff.
So, a question here from Fraser.
Thanks for your powerful talk. I did read your book many months ago and I thought it was terrific. It was a great read.
Thank you. More laughs than the talk, really.
No, the book was terrific. It was very raw in some ways. I found it very confronting in parts. But anyway, I'm just interested in your book. When in your 20s, you seem to be disconnected or searching about your family and your religion. You seem to become a bit disconnected from your family. And it seems in reading the book, you became, the value of family in your religion seemed to grow much more as you aged. And I'd be interested if you could talk about that development in your, family and religion becoming more important to you and having much more meaning. And just a fan question about the video and the autumn park, on the beginning. What was the thinking behind it? It just seems the autumn seems discordant from the
Well, I'll
song.
deal with that first. Yeah, no, there's a good reason behind it. I was a big fan of is it Howard Hawks' film Bringing Up Baby, or is it's Billy Wilder or Howard Hawks, isn't it? Howard Hawks made a film called Bring Up Baby, 1938, and Katharine Hepburn, Cary Grant. There's a great scene on a golf course where she's taken over a golf cart and she's going back and forth and being a troublemaker, and he's just being hapless. And it's a hilarious film, and I thought I'd like to honour that in this film clip. But Michael was absolutely appalled. He wanted to see me in black sequined miniskirt and high heels, and it was never going to be me. I mean, it was not me. He had a very different vision. And it was the first time we kind of worked together, and maybe he wasn't so familiar with Do-Re-Mi, or maybe he was. But anyway, I was never going to do that. And he had a stand-up row with the director for letting the clip go through. But the clip remains very popular, and people really like it, and it's aged well because I don't have to compare myself with a young woman who's wearing, black sequins and I don't know, on a golf course. No, I wouldn't have been on a golf course. But anyway, so yes, I think I was right and he was wrong, and he admits that in the end. The other question I think my journey is not an uncommon one. I think a lot of young people probably are searching. They have their family life, and they're very well supported, or whatever they've got. There are certain tenets of their being that they know, they're familiar with, they've been brought up. It's the mother's milk, and then they're trying to find what else is out there. Who else could I be, and what else is meaningful for me? And I discovered music, and in discovering music, I moved away. I was very, very keen to move away from the family home. My father was very difficult, as you might remember from the book, and I needed to get away and be able to, be fully. It was so liberating. It was the most extraordinary feeling, being able to not live in the family home anymore. And then that wasn't enough, so I had to leave the family town. So I moved to Sydney from Melbourne. And then that wasn't enough, and I had to move overseas. And all of it was fantastic. And by the time I got to Los Angeles in around 1989, suddenly things were sort of like had been able to shuck off all of the claustrophobia, I guess, of a very protective Jewish household, and I started kind of questioning, what I was at my core and what was left, and it was Pesach, it was Passover, and I was seeing all these Jews walking to and from synagogue, and then they were, going to go off home and have their Passover meal with their family, and here I was with my very, very lovely but not Jewish boyfriend, and I wasn't invited to a Seder, and there was no part of my life at that stage that was in any way Jewish. And it wasn't that I was missing religion. God had never really been in my life. My parents weren't religious, but there was something so deep and so core to my very being that it was an ache, and I had to address it. I realised that I had to address this thing that was missing in my life and put it back, and so I did. I started sleeping with a lot of Jewish boys till I found the right one who was a musician too.
Yeah, that was a great talk, Deborah. I'm going back to your book and your music life. Michael Gudinski, ring a bell? Can you tell us a bit about your time with Michael Gudinski? Did he die recently or something?
In 21, I think.
All right, okay, so you won't get libelled. It was a sort of bit tempestuous. Could you tell us a bit about
yes,
the music industry and that part of your life?
Well, I mean, Michael wasn't the music industry, although he kind of came close to it in Australia, to being the music industry. It's funny, he was very, very powerful. But I had nothing...
Just background people you're talking about.
Oh, yes, of course. Well, Michael Gudinski, if anyone doesn't know, was the head of Mushroom Records and the Mushroom music conglomerate, which ended up comprising of the Premier, which was their local booking agency, but also Frontier, which was their international booking agency, and they had a publishing arm, and there was a lot of aspects to this business. And he was pretty much had a hand in most young musicians' lives, particularly in Melbourne. Being a Sydney band at this point, Do-Re-Mi had formed in Sydney. We didn't have anything to do with Mushroom. We signed to Virgin Music record company. And then it wasn't until I was left, my relationship with Virgin ended, and I came back to Australia after living in Los Angeles and the UK. And then I took up with Mushroom, because the manager I had met was very fond, was very intimately connected with the whole Mushroom group, and it brought lots of acts up through there, Kylie Minogue included. And so it was kind of a fait accompli. I mean, you can read about that in the book too. That's a pretty interesting, nebulous kind of chapter about the way that the music industry works. The music business is incredibly corrupt, but it's not Michael particularly. I mean, Michael's just there being, taking advantage of everything that is already well and truly laid out by a lot of other people. And artists and musicians were not each other's friends. It was painted like that, but actually the artist was kept very much, was very naive, and that, young people who had, a song in their heart, and they just want to get on stage and they want to entertain people and they want to be famous. And they want everyone to hear their music, and they're very vulnerable because of that. But, and they're not thinking about money, and they're not thinking about the future, and they're not thinking maybe this first record that I make will be the most successful record that I make. They're not thinking that. They're thinking, oh, I'm going to embark on a fabulous career. But what generally happens is that the music business kind of takes everything that the artist does, and it's an exploitative relationship. So and it's not just Australia, it's all around the world. And, I don't know that it's ended with the less powerful music record companies have become. It still continues on with, the way streaming organisations work. But I had a great relationship with Michael. I really loved having someone to battle with, and he was a good battler. He was, and and we had some vigorous conversations about lots of different things, and sometimes I won, sometimes I didn't. But but he respected me as an equal. He didn't, and I did challenge Mushroom a couple of times on some really appalling practice, and they relented and went, oh, you got us there, okay, well we'll give you that. So it wasn't like he was fun. And I thoroughly enjoyed those years. But when it was over, it was absolutely over. But he stayed in my life, and he was very supportive of everything that Willie and I did. And we spoke just only a few weeks before he died. He would ring up out of the blue and say something almost unintelligible, and then get off the phone 10 seconds later, and then ring back and then say something more unintelligible, and then hang up again. He was an interesting guy. He really was an interesting guy, and I was very, very fond of him. And I was so sad that he died so young. I mean, he was 67, 69, 68. I don't know. It was very, very, very too soon. Yeah.
Question here. Thanks.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm on your side.
Good to know.
Yeah. Look, back in the 50s and 60s, the left loved Israel. I had all these lefty friends. They were all going there to work on the kibbutz. This is a perfect example of active communism, socialism. They couldn't praise Israel enough. Mm-hmm. So what has happened between then and now?
Well, the KGB, I think, had a lot to do with it. The Soviets initially were fans of Israel, but then something happened. The PLO became bedfellows Russia became their client state, and they were able to use Soviet propaganda, and they basically they were able to basically manipulate age-old anti-Semitic tropes like protocols of the Elders of Zion, and then all of the Jews kill babies to Christian babies to put the blood in their matzahs and for Passover, and a million there was why. It's hard to know the way the world kind of lines up. Sorry, go on. You.
Yeah, I have friends now who worked in the kibbutz in the 60s who are now anti-Israel.
Yeah.
Who live here,
Yeah.
and I just can't understand what the shift is.
Yeah, go on.
Respond? No, well, it's very difficult to understand, but I do believe there's something about Russia. The KGB were very, very effective propagandists, and the Arabs took that stuff to heart. Yasser Arafat was a great was a real learning curve for him, and he didn't want a state of Israel. The negotiations have never worked because the Palestinians have never wanted an Israeli state. There's never been able to be a two-state solution because the Palestinians don't want to share in any way. They do not want any corner of that part of the world to be Jewish, to have any kind of Jewish sovereignty on it. So they've been standing firm for all this time, and I think they think they're getting closer. I don't believe they are, but there's so much bloodshed, of course. I mean, it's terrible, it's inhuman, but the thing is that if any Arab leader was to try and make a peace deal with Israel at this point, his days would be numbered. His days would be numbered by hours. It's so terribly entrenched.
Sorry, so it's more of a comment on the other and what you think of it. I have often thought that one of the reasons is the left turn on Israel is in the 60s and 50s it was poor, and it was they stopped becoming, they were no longer in the victim sort of mindhood, and they've become very successful.
Yep.
And they stand on their own 2 feet.
Yep.
And they do well. And I just feel perhaps it's because anyone who does well must be an oppressor. Mm-hmm. And anyone who is a victim is a martyr.
I feel like that's a more recent overlay.
Yeah, recent, yeah.
And but anti-Semitism in the left, in university campuses, etc., it has longer roots than that, a longer history than that. And it is hard to know. I guess when did Israel become? Israel became less socialist, more capitalist in the 90s, with Netanyahu's first term. He was really very interested in making Israel into a tech power, because he knew that Iran had it in for Israel, and the only way that Israel was going to be able to combat that was to become a wealthy country, and so that changed a lot of things. But the anti-Semitism predated that.
Yeah, I mean more the dislike of Israel per se. I mean anti-Semitism is obviously.
Yeah, and now it's I don't know.
Okay, there's a question, there's one up the back and then there's a final one up here.
Sure. Deborah, thank you for being so authentic. And my question's a bit of a confusing one, because it's really my own kind of question of myself, but I'm hoping you can help me out here. And it's one of kind of hypocrisy. And hearing you speak, and specifically the story you told about you and Willie at the Mushroom Records gig, and the backlash that you received for doing something that was pretty symbolic and quite sensible, if you ask me, in terms of the moment, the time. But I think of myself and the fact that we pulled our subscription to Sydney Theatre Company on the basis of that curtain call. And I felt a visceral disgust with what happened at that show, and that seemed the natural thing to do, to pull our subscription. But then I hear the stories that you tell of boycott and people not giving you a fair voice, and I feel, am I being hypocritical? And many in the community are similar to me, but are we being consistent on that front?
Well, I mean, that was the conversation that we were supposed to have. Patricia Corvellis and I were supposed to have what was the equivalence and how, that I feel that particular event, that the actors kind of hijacked the audience, who were applauding away at their wonderful performance that they just delivered, and then they realised they kind of been hijacked, because in fact they were not just applauding their performance, they were applauding their political stance. But I feel like our thing was slightly different. There wasn't a hijack so much. We kind of stated it fairly clearly up front, and no one was clapping at that point or doing anything. But that seems like a fairly venal kind of comparison. I don't know. I mean, look, it's tricky, but ultimately it's a personal decision. I mean, if you feel uncomfortable about putting your money into a place where people clearly hate you, then it's probably a good idea not to give them the money. And, obviously, there's a lot of people out there that clearly hate me. I'm not sure that they understand quite why. And they've made their feelings known too. I mean, I don't agree with it, of course, but, I think it's appalling, but I'm not sure that you can, well, I guess there are laws. I don't know. There are probably laws that you can conjure to say you can't get rid of this person for their political beliefs. But those actors were not fired. Everything went on as normal. It's just that subscribers pulled their subscriptions, and I don't know. It's not quite the same thing.
Got to be brief. Second last question up the back.
I apologise for a lighter note, but...
Oh, don't apologise.
Where did those lines that shocked us way back in the 1980s, when we heard them on the radio in Man Overboard, come from?
Oh, well, Dorlan and I wrote that song together. We were, I guess, we were disgruntled with the relationships that we were both in, and they were, we were... what's the word? Kicking it around and kind of coming up with more and more crazy stuff. It was good. It was a really fun. It's been a very fun song to sing for all these years later. I've loved singing it, and so made a splash at the time, and it's still relevant.
I've got a final question from one of our Zoom people he said the Institute had Michael Gwenda here late last year when he wrote a book just before 7th of October, and she says you wrote a book, as you pointed out tonight, just before 7th October. So if you're going to do a new edition, which might well be the case, what would you add? You wouldn't take anything out, presumably, but what would you add?
No, I don't think I would take anything out. Look, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I could put in after the fact. It has been one of the most insane years I've ever had, and I think that we're all still feeling incredibly discombobulated. I mean, we've just been hit. We had the pandemic, not that long ago, and now this, and it's very testing. And I know everyone that I know is just questioning their lives here, and that's really quite tragic, I think. We've always been such a wonderful, pluralist, welcoming, generous society, and things have changed, and people are feeling it.
Many thanks.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Well, Deborah Conway finished with the word welcome, and you're certainly welcome back, and Willie, anytime you like. Terrific performance tonight. Books on sale outside. A lot of people here. It's a busy day. Well done, Deborah, and good luck with the book.